A simple trip to the courthouse takes an unexpected turn when a black woman is stopped at the door, forced to wait outside, while others are allowed to walk right in. But what happens when the truth about who she really is finally comes to light? How will the people in the courthouse react when they realize the mistake they've made? Let us know what you think in the comments before we jump into this shocking story. Danielle Carter adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, taking a deep breath as she approached the entrance of the downtown courthouse. The air was thick with the energy of the busy day ahead. Lawyers in sharp suits hurried up the stone steps, clerks rushed past with stacks of files, and citizens nervously waited at the door, eager to get their business done. As she reached for the handle, she was suddenly stopped by a uniformed officer. "Hold it right there," the man said, raising his hand to block her path. Danielle stopped in her tracks, looking up at him. The officer was tall, with broad shoulders and a buzz cut that made him appear even more rigid and stern. His badge read Randall. Danielle stayed calm and polite, responding with a simple, "Excuse me?" Randall looked her up and down, his eyes scanning her navy blue blazer, matching slacks and natural curls neatly tied in a tight bun. His lips pressed into a hard line, clearly sizing her up. "Only people with business inside can enter," he said flatly, already making up his mind. Danielle raised an eyebrow, observing that at least 5 people had walked in without being questioned, but she kept her cool. "I do have business inside," she replied calmly. "I need to get through." Randall chuckled dismissively, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. You can wait outside until your name is called." Danielle's jaw tightened. She crossed her arms, now clearly frustrated. "And what exactly makes you think I don't belong inside right now?" she asked, her tone more assertive. Randall's smirk deepened, as if he found the confrontation amusing. "We get a lot of people who think they can just walk in whenever they want. Defendants, witnesses, people showing up for jury duty too early. If you have official business, you'll be called." Danielle's eyes darkened as the implication hit her. He had already decided she wasn't important enough to be in the courthouse, assuming she wasn't an attorney, a clerk, or someone with real authority in the building. She exhaled slowly, trying to keep her composure. "I wasn't aware that standing outside like a second-class citizen was part of courthouse protocol," she remarked, the heat rising in her chest but her voice still steady. Randall sighed dramatically as if she were the one making things difficult. "Look, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. You need to wait like everyone else." Danielle's fingers twitched at her side, her frustration building. "Like everyone else?" she repeated, shaking her head. "I've been standing here for 2 minutes, and I've counted at least 5 people who walked right past you without being stopped." Randall's smirk faltered for a moment, but he shrugged it off. "They were attorneys," he said dismissively. "You could tell that just by looking at them." He let out a small, exasperated laugh. "Miss, I've been doing this job for years. I know who belongs and who doesn't." Danielle exhaled sharply, her gaze lingering on the people still walking past them without a care in the world, while she was being treated as if she didn't belong in a place meant for justice. She shifted her weight, adjusting her bag, and took a step closer to Randall, looking him straight in the eye. "You're making a huge mistake," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. Randall's expression twisted into something smug. "I don't think so," he retorted, "but you do whatever you think is best, sweetheart." Danielle stiffened at the condescending tone, but before she could respond, another voice interrupted the tension in the air. "Problem here?" Danielle turned to see a second officer approaching. He was older, black, with graying hair at his temples, and his badge read Jenkins. Randall scoffed, jerking his head toward Danielle. "Just handling things," he said, clearly annoyed. "She's refusing to wait outside like everybody else." Jenkins looked at Danielle, then at Randall, his lips pressing into a thin line as he measured the situation. His voice was gentler when he turned to her. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his tone calm and respectful. "Danielle Carter," she replied without hesitation. Jenkins squinted slightly, then asked, "And what's your business inside?" Danielle glanced at Randall, who still appeared to be enjoying the situation, and then back at Jenkins. She lifted her chin, confidence radiating from her. "I have a meeting with the chief judge." Randall let out a loud laugh, full of disbelief. Oh, that's a good one, he scoffed, shaking his head. Sweetheart, if you had a meeting with the chief judge, you wouldn't be standing out here talking to me. Danielle's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder, revealing a crisp white document sealed with gold. Holding it up between them, Randall's face dropped. Jenkins, on the other hand, leaned in slightly, his eyes widening as he read the document. United States District Court Appointment Confirmation, Judge Danielle Carter. Jenkins immediately straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. Judge Carter, he said quickly, his voice now firm and respectful. I apologize for any inconvenience. Please go right in. Randall's mouth opened and closed, his face pale as he stammered. Wait, what? His eyes darted between the document and Danielle, clearly realizing his huge mistake. Danielle simply smiled at him, her expression cool and collected. I told you, she said smoothly, you were making a mistake. The murmurs around them began to grow louder as people whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the moment. Jenkins stepped aside, his face still apologetic. My apologies, ma'am, he said, gesturing toward the doors. Danielle nodded politely, acknowledging him before turning back to Randall, whose face had now turned a deep shade of red. You might want to rethink how you enforce those rules of yours, she said calmly, her voice steady but filled with quiet power. With that, she walked past him and into the courthouse. As she stepped inside, the whispers followed her. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, curiosity, shock, and surprise clearly written across their faces. But Danielle kept walking, her head held high, her shoulders squared. She was ready for what was to come. Because today, she wasn't just entering the courthouse, she was stepping into her courthouse, and the people inside were about to find out exactly who Judge Danielle Carter was. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors as she made her way through the building. The energy inside was a stark contrast to what she had just endured outside. Lawyers moved with purpose through the halls, clerks carried stacks of legal files, and the distant sound of a gavel striking wood echoed through the corridors. But as Danielle stepped deeper into the courthouse, a different kind of silence followed her, one filled with the weight of the scene that had unfolded outside. People who had witnessed the interaction at the entrance continued to whisper among themselves, some still filming her with their phones raised, others simply staring in disbelief. Their gazes flicked between her and the officer Randall, who was still standing frozen outside, processing the magnitude of his mistake. Danielle barely paid any attention to them. She had business to take care of, and nothing was going to stop her now. As she approached the main lobby, she spotted a familiar face, Judge Robert Hamilton, a senior judge who had mentored her during her judicial clerkship years ago. He was a tall, distinguished man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The moment he saw her, his expression brightened. Danielle. His voice carried through the hall, immediately capturing the attention of those nearby. If anyone still had doubts about whether she belonged in this space, Judge Hamilton's warm greeting erased them completely. Danielle smiled, reaching out for the handshake he extended. Good morning, Judge Hamilton. I hope I'm not late for a meeting. Not at all, he reassured her. His eyes briefly flicked over her shoulder, noticing the small crowd that had gathered. But it looks like you've already made quite the impression. Danielle didn't need to turn around to know exactly what he meant. The whispered conversations, the lingering stares, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact from some of the courthouse staff, it was all there. She sighed and shook her head. An unfortunate misunderstanding at the entrance, she explained simply. Judge Hamilton's expression darkened. Though he might not have known the full details yet, he could easily put the pieces together. His lips pressed into a thin line. I see, he said slowly, then glanced at one of the bailiffs standing nearby. Make a note for me, will you? I want to know exactly what happened. The bailiff nodded, already scribbling something down on his notepad. Danielle exhaled, her thoughts momentarily tempted to linger on the discomfort she had just caused the people who had underestimated her. But she wasn't here for that. She was here for something bigger. As she turned to walk toward the judge's chambers, a voice called out behind her. Judge Carter. She recognized the voice instantly. It was Officer Jenkins, the same officer who had intervened when Randall had blocked her entry. He approached her cautiously, his face tight with concern. "I just wanted to apologize again," he said, clearly regretful. "I didn't realize who you were." Danielle studied him for a moment. Unlike Randall, Jenkins hadn't been dismissive or smug. He had simply followed protocol until he realized that protocol had been applied unfairly. She gave him a small nod, her expression softening slightly. "It's not about who I am, Officer Jenkins," she said, her voice firm but calm. "It's about how I was treated. I shouldn't have had to prove anything to be let in, just like the others who walked right past Randall without issue." Jenkins lowered his gaze, shame flashing in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted. "And I'll make sure this gets reported properly. This isn't how we're supposed to operate." Danielle didn't allow her expression to soften too much. She appreciated his acknowledgement, but words alone weren't enough. Change had to happen. "I hope so," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and continued walking toward the judge's chambers. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was far different from the tension she had faced outside. Several judges were already seated around the long wooden table. Their discussions paused as she entered, a few heads turning in her direction. "Judge Carter, welcome," said Chief Judge Evelyn Moore, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair neatly pinned back. She gestured to the chair beside her. "We were just getting started." Danielle took her seat, nodding to the other judges, some she had worked with before, others she was meeting for the first time. But they all shared something in common. They knew she belonged here. The meeting proceeded as planned, covering upcoming cases, policy changes, and court efficiency improvements. But near the end, Judge Hamilton cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "There's one more thing I'd like to address," he began, signaling that the next chapter of the day was about to unfold.